There is a moment after a breakup that most people never see. It's the quiet moment that happens long after the arguments are over, after the messages stop, after the doors close, and two lives begin to move in separate directions. On the outside, it can look like the avoidant walked away easily, calm, unbothered, almost relieved. To everyone watching, it may have seemed like they never truly cared in the first place. But what most people don't understand is that the story of an avoidant's emotions doesn't follow the same timeline as everyone else's. When the relationship ends, the empath usually feels everything immediately: the heartbreak, the confusion, the overwhelming flood of memories and unanswered questions. They replay conversations in their mind, wondering what went wrong and why their love wasn't enough to keep the connection alive. For the empath, the emotional storm begins right away. But for the avoidant, the storm comes later. At first, there is silence inside them, a strange sense of freedom, almost like a weight has been lifted. They tell themselves they made the right decision. They convince themselves the relationship was too intense, too emotional, too demanding, and for a while that belief feels real. They move forward as if nothing has changed. They focus on distractions, work, hobbies, new people, new routines, anything that keeps their mind away from what they just left behind. But something subtle has already begun. Because when an avoidant rejects someone who loved them deeply, the emotional consequences don't disappear. They simply hide beneath the surface, quiet, unnoticed, waiting. And the strange part is this: the moment they push the empath away is often the moment they unknowingly create the very absence that will later haunt them. You see, people with avoidant patterns don't usually reject love because they don't care. In many cases, they reject love because it reaches parts of them they've spent their entire lives protecting. Real emotional intimacy feels dangerous to them. Not because it's unhealthy, but because it exposes vulnerabilities they are not used to facing. When someone loves them on a surface level, they can handle it: casual affection, light conversations, emotional distance. These things feel manageable, safe, predictable. But an empath does something different. An empath doesn't just love someone for who they appear to be on the outside. They see the hidden emotions, the guarded heart, the quiet fears that exist behind the walls. And instead of running away from those things, they try to understand them. They try to offer patience, compassion, space. And for a while this feels comforting to the avoidant. The empath becomes someone who accepts them even when they withdraw, someone who doesn't immediately abandon them when they pull away, someone who senses their internal struggles even when they don't explain them out loud. But this kind of emotional closeness can also become overwhelming. Because the closer the empath gets, the harder it becomes for the avoidant to maintain their emotional distance. The walls they built over the years begin to crack. Vulnerabilities they buried long ago start rising to the surface, and instead of leaning into that connection, their instinct is often to escape it. Not because the empath is doing something wrong, but because the closeness itself feels too powerful, so they begin to create distance. Maybe it starts subtly: less communication, less affection, less emotional availability. The empath senses something changing and tries even harder to reconnect. They offer more understanding, more patience, more reassurance. But the more the empath reaches for closeness, the more the avoidant feels pressure building inside them. Eventually, the tension becomes too much, and that's when the rejection happens. Sometimes it's sudden, sometimes it's gradual, but the outcome is the same. The avoidant convinces themselves that leaving is the only way to regain emotional control. They tell themselves the relationship was too intense, too complicated, too emotionally draining. What they don't realize in that moment is that they are walking away from something incredibly rare, because the kind of love an empath offers is not something people encounter every day. Empaths don't love casually. They love with depth, with curiosity, with a genuine desire to understand another person's inner world. They notice the small emotional shifts others ignore. They listen to the unspoken words hidden behind silence. They stay present during moments when most people would walk away. In a world where many relationships remain on the surface, that level of emotional presence becomes extraordinary. But while the relationship is happening, avoidants often struggle to fully appreciate it. Instead of seeing the empath's love as a gift, they may see it as pressure. Instead of feeling supported, they may feel exposed, and instead of allowing themselves to relax into the connection, they begin searching for ways to protect their independence. So when they leave, they truly believe they are solving a problem. For a short period of time, the emotional intensity disappears, the expectations fade, the relationship dynamics no longer demand their attention, and in that early stage, the avoidant may genuinely feel relief. This is why the breakup can feel so confusing to the empath. Because while they are grieving deeply, the avoidant appears unaffected, but the truth is more complicated than it seems. Avoidants have a unique way of processing emotions. Instead of confronting their feelings immediately, they tend to suppress them. They push them aside. They bury them under logic, distraction, and independence. At first, this strategy works. Life continues. Days turn into weeks. Conversations with friends replace the deep talks they once had with the empath. New routines fill the empty spaces in their schedule. And because the empath is no longer there to mirror their emotions back to them, it becomes easier to pretend nothing important was lost. But suppression is not the same as healing. And emotions that are buried rarely stay buried forever. As time passes, the absence of the empath begins to create small moments of reflection. Maybe it happens late at night, when the distractions fade. Maybe it appears during quiet drives or peaceful weekends, when their mind finally slows down. A memory surfaces, a conversation they once had, a moment when the empath understood something about them without needing it explained. A time when they felt accepted, even during their most distant moods. At first, these memories seem harmless, just brief flashes of the past. But slowly, those flashes begin to grow stronger, because something else becomes noticeable too. The emotional environment around them has changed. The empath's presence was not just about love or companionship. It created a space where the avoidant could exist without constantly performing or explaining themselves. The empath had a way of making room for their silence, their confusion, their emotional contradictions. Without that presence, relationships with others may start to feel different, more superficial, more transactional, less understanding. And this realization doesn't always happen immediately. Sometimes it takes months, sometimes even longer. But eventually the avoidant begins to recognize a quiet truth they didn't expect. The person they once rejected offered something they haven't been able to replace. The empath's love had a certain depth that is difficult to find again, not because other people are incapable of love, but because the empath's emotional awareness created a rare kind of connection. They didn't just love the avoidant when things were easy. They loved them during moments of distance, during silence, during confusion. They tried to understand the parts of the avoidant that even the avoidant themselves struggled to understand. And when that kind of presence disappears, its absence becomes noticeable in ways that are difficult to explain. This is often when the avoidant begins to miss the empath for the first time, not in a dramatic way, not with overwhelming heartbreak like the empath may have experienced earlier, but in subtle waves of awareness. They start noticing how rare that understanding truly was. They remember how the empath could sense when something was wrong without being told, how they created emotional safety without demanding constant explanations, how they stayed patient even when the avoidant struggled to express themselves. And slowly, the narrative they once believed begins to change. The relationship that once felt overwhelming begins to look different through the lens of distance. Moments they once dismissed suddenly appear meaningful. Conversations they barely appreciated begin to carry emotional weight. The empathy they once resisted now feels comforting in memory. But by the time this realization arrives, something else has often changed too. The empath is no longer waiting in the same place they left them. Because while the avoidant delayed their emotional processing, the empath faced their pain directly. They went through the heartbreak, the sleepless nights, the difficult process of healing and rebuilding their sense of self. And over time, empaths begin to grow from that experience. They start learning boundaries. They rediscover their worth. They understand that their ability to love deeply is not a weakness but a rare strength that deserves to be valued. So while the avoidant is just beginning to feel the absence of what they lost, the empath may already be on a completely different path. And this is where the emotional story becomes even more complicated. Because the person the avoidant rejected may no longer be the same person they left behind, and the realization of that truth often arrives much later than they ever expected. At first, it appears as a quiet thought that slips into their mind without warning, a simple question that lingers longer than they would like to admit. It sounds something like this: what if that connection was actually rare? For a long time, they convinced themselves that relationships like that were common, that emotional support, patience, and deep understanding could easily be found somewhere else. They believed that if one connection ended, another one would appear without much effort. After all, the world is full of people. Opportunities for relationships are everywhere. At least that's what logic tells them. But logic doesn't always understand emotional reality. As weeks turn into months, they begin meeting new people. Conversations happen, connections start. Some relationships even seem promising at first. On the surface, everything looks normal. Life appears to be moving forward the way it's supposed to. Yet something subtle keeps happening beneath the surface. Every new interaction quietly invites comparison. They may not admit it out loud, but their mind begins measuring emotional moments against memories of the empath. Not because they are trying to hold on to the past, but because the emotional depth they once experienced set a standard they didn't fully recognize while the relationship was still alive. With the empath, there was a kind of emotional awareness that felt almost effortless. The empath didn't need everything explained in detail. They noticed changes in tone, pauses in conversation, subtle shifts in energy. They sensed when something was wrong even before words were spoken. At the time, that level of emotional attentiveness may have felt overwhelming, almost invasive. It forced the avoidant to confront feelings they were used to keeping hidden. But now, without that presence, something feels missing. New connections may be pleasant, but they rarely reach the same depth. Conversations stay on the surface. Emotional misunderstandings happen more often. Moments that once felt natural now require explanation. And slowly, a realization begins to form. The empath didn't just love them. The empath understood them. That kind of understanding is not something most people experience often in life. It requires patience, emotional awareness, and a willingness to stay present even during complicated moments. The empath had offered that kind of presence without expecting perfection in return. They stayed through distance, through silence, through confusion, and now that space is gone. This realization becomes even stronger when the silence left behind by the empath begins to feel heavier than expected. At the beginning of the breakup, the quiet may have felt peaceful. No difficult conversations, no emotional intensity, no pressure to respond or explain feelings. But over time, that quiet transforms into something different. Because the empath's presence was not just about conversation, it was about emotional companionship, a sense that someone was there, not just physically but emotionally. Someone who listened with genuine curiosity. Someone who cared about the deeper layers of what they were feeling. When that presence disappears, life may still move forward, but something important feels absent. Sometimes the avoidant notices it during small everyday moments, a situation where they would have normally shared a thought with the empath. A moment when something good happens and their instinct is to reach for the person who used to understand their excitement without needing long explanations. But that person is no longer there. The message goes unsent. The thought remains unshared, and the silence lingers longer than expected. It's in these quiet moments that the absence of the empath begins to echo through their mind. They may start wondering what the empath is doing now, whether they're happy, whether they've moved on, whether they still think about the relationship at all. Curiosity slowly replaces the emotional distance that once felt so necessary. And along with curiosity comes memory. Memories have a strange way of changing over time. During the relationship, the avoidant may have focused heavily on the difficult moments, the disagreements, the emotional intensity, the feeling of pressure that closeness sometimes created, but distance has a way of shifting perspective. As time passes, the difficult memories begin to soften. They lose some of their emotional weight. Meanwhile, the positive memories grow stronger. Moments of laughter return to the surface, quiet nights of conversation, the empath's ability to stay calm during emotional storms, the patience they offered even when things felt complicated. These memories begin to replay in the mind, sometimes unexpectedly, and with each memory comes a growing awareness. The empath had created a kind of emotional safety that is incredibly rare. They didn't demand perfection. They didn't expect constant emotional availability. They allowed the avoidant to move at their own pace, even when that pace involved distance. For a long time, the avoidant believed that safety would always be available if they wanted it again. But life rarely works that way. Because while the avoidant was slowly beginning to reflect on the past, something else had been happening in the empath's life: healing. The empath didn't escape the pain of the breakup. They faced it directly. The nights of sadness, the questions about their worth, the difficult process of letting go of someone they truly cared about. But empaths have a unique ability to grow through emotional experiences. Instead of building thicker walls, they often begin strengthening their sense of self. They start recognizing that their ability to love deeply is not something to apologize for, it's something to protect. They learn to create healthier boundaries. They begin understanding that not everyone deserves access to the depth of their heart. And little by little, they begin rebuilding their emotional independence. Meanwhile, the avoidant may still be navigating their delayed emotional realization, and sometimes the moment that accelerates this realization comes unexpectedly. It might happen when they see a photo online, a glimpse of the empath smiling again, a moment that shows the empath living life without the weight of the past relationship. Or maybe they hear through mutual friends that the empath is doing well, that they seem peaceful, confident, focused on their own growth. For some avoidants, this becomes a powerful emotional turning point. Because during the relationship, they often assumed the empath would always be there, that their patience and understanding were constant features of the connection. Seeing the empath move forward disrupts that assumption. Suddenly, the idea that the empath might truly be gone becomes real. And along with that realization comes something unfamiliar: loss. Not the dramatic heartbreak the empath may have experienced earlier, but a quieter, deeper awareness that something meaningful slipped away. The connection that once felt overwhelming now appears different in memory. It begins to look valuable, irreplaceable. They start wondering whether they misunderstood the relationship while they were inside it, whether the emotional closeness they once feared was actually something rare and meaningful. These thoughts don't always appear all at once. They grow slowly, like a realization unfolding piece by piece. And the more they reflect, the more they recognize a difficult truth. New relationships may offer companionship, attraction, enjoyable moments, but the emotional depth the empath brought into their life hasn't been easily replicated. The empath didn't just share experiences with them, they shared emotional presence. They created a space where vulnerability could exist without judgment, where silence didn't feel uncomfortable, where complicated feelings could be explored instead of avoided. That kind of connection changes the emotional landscape of a person's life, and once someone has experienced it, its absence becomes noticeable. This is often the stage when avoidants begin truly missing the empath they once rejected, not just missing the idea of a relationship, but missing the unique emotional bond that existed between them. They may start revisiting old conversations in their mind, remembering the way the empath listened carefully, the way they tried to understand instead of criticize. They begin recognizing how much patience the empath offered during moments when they themselves struggled to communicate. And with that recognition comes a quiet question that can be difficult to face. What if they let go of something truly meaningful? Because sometimes the most powerful realizations in life don't happen during the moment of decision. They happen afterward, long after the choice has been made, long after the opportunity to hold on to something special has already passed. And for many avoidants, the process of understanding what the empath meant to them begins only when the empath's presence has fully disappeared from their daily life. The absence becomes a mirror, a reflection of what once existed, and the more clearly they see that reflection, the harder it becomes to ignore the emotional truth forming in their mind. They didn't just walk away from a relationship. They walked away from someone who loved them with extraordinary depth, Someone who tried to understand their silence, their fears, and their emotional distance. Someone who offered a rare kind of connection that is not easily replaced. And now, in the quiet space left behind, that realization begins settling deeper into their awareness. Not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable truth that continues unfolding with time. The realization grows quietly inside them, almost like a feeling they can't fully explain yet. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's persistent. And then one day something happens that makes the realization impossible to ignore. They see the empath again. Maybe it's through a photo, a social media update, or a brief moment when someone mentions them in conversation. Maybe it's completely unexpected, just a glimpse of their life continuing without the relationship that once defined so much of their emotional world. And in that moment, the avoidant notices something that surprises them. The empath looks different, not necessarily in appearance, but in energy. There is a calmness there, a quiet strength, the kind of emotional steadiness that often comes after someone has walked through heartbreak and come out the other side stronger. For a long time, the avoidant may have imagined the empath still feeling the pain of the breakup, still wondering why things ended the way they did, still emotionally connected to the past. But seeing them peaceful changes everything, because suddenly it becomes clear that the empath has moved forward. They are not waiting anymore. They are not searching for answers from the past. They have continued building their life, rediscovering themselves, and reclaiming the emotional energy they once invested in the relationship. And for the avoidant, this realization can create an unexpected emotional shift. During the relationship, they often felt like the one in control of the distance. They decided when to pull away, when to reconnect, when to open up, and when to close off. The emotional rhythm of the connection often revolved around their comfort level. But now that dynamic has changed. The empath is no longer standing in the same place. The person who once reached for understanding has now learned how to stand firmly in their own emotional space. They no longer chase closeness from someone who isn't ready to give it. And suddenly the avoidant finds themselves in a position they didn't expect. They are the ones looking back. They are the ones wondering. They are the ones feeling the quiet pull of memories that no longer belong to the present. This reversal can feel confusing for someone who is used to emotional distance, because now the distance is no longer something they control, it's something that exists beyond their reach. And when that shift happens, memories begin returning with even greater intensity. The mind starts replaying moments that once seemed ordinary, small interactions that carried emotional meaning at the time, but were never fully appreciated. A quiet conversation late at night, a moment when the empath noticed they were feeling overwhelmed before they even said a word. A time when the empath stayed patient during a difficult emotional phase, offering support instead of judgment. These memories begin appearing with a new kind of clarity, because distance has changed the way they are seen. During the relationship, the avoidance focus may have been on the pressure they felt from emotional closeness. They may have interpreted the empath's attentiveness as something demanding, something that required more vulnerability than they were ready to offer. But now those same moments look different in hindsight. They begin to see the care that existed behind the empath's actions. The effort, the patience, the quiet commitment to understanding someone who often struggled to express themselves openly. And this new perspective can create an uncomfortable emotion that slowly grows stronger with time. Guilt. Not the loud kind of guilt that appears immediately after a mistake, but the reflective kind that develops when someone begins seeing the past more clearly. They start recognizing how much the empath invested in the relationship, how many times they tried to keep communication open, how many moments they stayed present, even when things felt uncertain. And they realize something that may not have been obvious before. The empath tried longer than most people would have. They gave chances. They offered understanding. They stayed through emotional distance that many others might have walked away from much earlier. And the avoidant begins to understand that this kind of patience is not something everyone offers. In many relationships, emotional withdrawal quickly leads to disconnection. When someone repeatedly creates distance, the other person eventually stops trying. But the empath stayed. They tried to see beyond the walls. They believed that beneath the avoidance distance, there was someone capable of deep connection. And realizing this can create a heavy sense of reflection, because the avoidant now sees how much emotional effort was being offered to them while they were focused mainly on protecting their independence. They start wondering whether they misunderstood the relationship entirely, whether the emotional closeness they feared was actually something supportive rather than suffocating. And as this reflection deepens, another realization begins to appear. By the time avoidants fully understand what the empath meant to them, the empath has often already transformed. Heartbreak has a way of reshaping people. For empaths, the end of a deep connection can become a powerful catalyst for growth. They begin asking themselves important questions about the way they love and the boundaries they maintain. They start recognizing that while their ability to care deeply is beautiful, it also requires protection. They learn that love should not feel like constant emotional chasing. It should not require them to repeatedly prove their value to someone who cannot meet them halfway. So they begin creating healthier emotional limits. They become more selective about where they invest their energy. And perhaps most importantly, they begin recognizing their own worth. This transformation doesn't make them cold or distant. It simply makes them wiser. They still carry the same depth of compassion, the same ability to connect emotionally, but now that depth is paired with self-respect. And when avoidants eventually feel the desire to reconnect, they sometimes discover that the empath they once knew has changed. Not in their kindness, but in their boundaries. The empath may still care about the memories they shared. They may still appreciate the emotional connection that once existed, but they no longer allow themselves to be drawn back into the same patterns that once caused them pain. They have learned that love should feel mutual, that emotional effort should move in both directions, and this can create one of the most profound realizations for the avoidant, because the version of the empath who once gave endless patience is no longer available in the same way. The person who once waited for emotional clarity has now learned to move forward without it, and the avoidant is left standing in a place they didn't expect to be, looking back at a connection they once believed was too overwhelming, only to discover that it was actually something incredibly meaningful. This moment of realization can be deeply transformative. For some avoidants, it becomes a turning point. The experience of losing someone who truly understood them forces them to confront emotional patterns they may have avoided for years. They begin questioning why closeness felt so threatening in the first place, why vulnerability felt dangerous, why independence sometimes came at the cost of genuine connection. These questions are not easy to answer, but they mark the beginning of emotional growth. Because sometimes the most powerful lessons about love don't come from relationships that last forever. They come from the ones that reveal parts of ourselves we didn't know we needed to understand. The empath's presence often serves as a mirror, a reflection of emotional depth, patience, and compassion. And when that mirror disappears, it leaves behind an imprint that continues influencing the avoidant long after the relationship has ended. They may start approaching future connections differently, more aware of the value of emotional presence, more conscious of the way distance can affect someone who genuinely cares. The empath may no longer be part of their daily life, but the impact of that relationship stays with them. Because once someone has experienced a connection built on deep emotional awareness, it becomes difficult to forget what that kind of closeness felt like, even if they once ran from it, even if they once rejected it. And as this understanding continues growing inside them, one final realization slowly begins to take shape. Some losses reveal their true meaning only after the opportunity to repair them has already passed. That realization settles slowly into the avoidant's mind, almost like a quiet truth they can't escape anymore. It doesn't arrive all at once. Instead, it grows stronger each time they reflect on the past, each time they remember how the connection once felt when the empath was still part of their everyday life. By now, something important has become clear. The person they once walked away from is no longer standing in the same emotional place. The empath who once tried to reach their heart has evolved into someone who understands their own worth more deeply than before, and that changes everything. Because empaths have a powerful ability to love, but they also have a powerful ability to learn. When they finally realize that their love was repeatedly offered to someone who couldn't receive it fully, something inside them shifts. They begin to understand that love without balance slowly drains the soul. So they begin protecting themselves in ways they never did before. This doesn't mean they stop caring. It doesn't mean they erase the memories or pretend the relationship never mattered. But they no longer allow themselves to remain in situations where their emotional depth is taken for granted. For the avoidant, discovering this change can be both surprising and painful. During the relationship, they may have assumed the empath would always remain available, that their patience had no limit, that if they ever wanted to return, the empath would still be waiting in the same place. But the truth is that growth moves people forward. And by the time avoidants begin feeling the full weight of what they lost, the empath has often moved into a new chapter of life. They have healed enough to stop chasing closure from someone who once pulled away. They have rebuilt their emotional center around their own self-respect, rather than the hope that someone else might change. And most importantly, they have learned a quiet but powerful lesson. Love should never require someone to abandon themselves. For the avoidant, this moment of realization can feel deeply confronting, because it forces them to see the relationship from a completely different perspective than the one they held before. What once felt like pressure now looks like devotion. What once felt overwhelming now appears as genuine emotional presence. The empath's patience, their attempts to communicate, their willingness to stay through confusion, all of it begins to look different when viewed from a place of hindsight, and the avoidant begins understanding something they once struggled to see. They didn't just leave a relationship. They left someone who was offering them emotional safety. That realization can stir a mixture of emotions: regret, curiosity, reflection, sometimes even a quiet desire to reconnect. Because when someone finally understands the value of what they had, the instinct to return can feel almost automatic. They begin imagining conversations that never happened, words they wish they had spoken earlier, moments when they could have chosen vulnerability instead of distance. And sometimes they consider reaching out, not always with the intention of rebuilding the relationship, but with a desire to reconnect with the emotional connection they once experienced. But this is where the story often takes an unexpected turn. Because by the time the avoidant reaches this stage of awareness, the empath has already walked through their own emotional transformation. They are no longer the same person who once waited for reassurance, the same person who hoped their patience would eventually create the closeness they longed for. They have grown stronger in their boundaries, more protective of their energy, more aware that the love they give so freely deserves to be received with equal care. And when the avoidant finally looks back toward them, hoping to reconnect with that familiar warmth, they may discover something difficult. The empath still remembers the past, but they no longer live in it. They may respond with kindness, with calmness, with the understanding that comes from emotional maturity, but they are no longer willing to return to the same dynamic that once caused them pain. Because growth has changed their perspective, they now understand that love must be mutual, that emotional availability must flow in both directions. And while they may still appreciate the connection that once existed, they refuse to step back into a relationship that requires them to shrink their needs or silence their feelings. For the avoidant, this moment can be incredibly eye-opening. It becomes the final mirror reflecting the full truth of what happened. They see clearly how much the empath once offered, how much patience was extended, how many chances were quietly given, and they recognize that those chances were not infinite. Empaths love deeply, but they also learn deeply. Once they understand their own worth, they begin choosing relationships where their emotional presence is valued rather than questioned. And for the avoidant, this understanding becomes one of the most powerful lessons they will ever face. Because they begin realizing something about the nature of the connection they lost. What they miss is not just the person, it's the emotional experience that came with them. The way the empath listened without judgment, the way they created space for complicated emotions, the way they offered acceptance during moments when the avoidant felt uncertain about themselves. Those qualities are not easily replaced. In many future relationships, the avoidant may encounter affection, attraction, companionship, but the rare emotional awareness the empath carried becomes a memory that quietly lingers in the background. And that memory leaves an imprint. It shapes how they see intimacy moving forward. It encourages them to question the walls they once relied on for protection. It reminds them that real connection requires vulnerability, even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable. For some avoidants, this realization becomes the beginning of emotional growth. They start recognizing patterns in their past relationships, the ways they withdrew when closeness increased, the moments they prioritized independence over connection without fully understanding why, and slowly they begin working on those patterns. Not because someone forced them to, but because the loss of the empath showed them what genuine connection looks like. Sometimes a relationship's purpose is not simply to last forever. Sometimes its purpose is to reveal something important about ourselves, to show us where our fears exist, to reveal the kind of love we are capable of giving and receiving. And the empath often becomes that teacher in the avoidance life. Even if the relationship ends, the lesson remains. Because once someone has experienced a love that sees beyond their emotional walls, they can never completely forget what that felt like. The empath may continue forward, building a life filled with healthier connections, deeper self-respect, and a renewed sense of emotional clarity. They carry the wisdom gained from loving someone who couldn't fully meet them at the time. And the avoidant carries a different kind of lesson. They carry the memory of someone who once tried to understand them more deeply than anyone else had before. Someone who stayed when things became complicated. Someone who offered emotional safety during moments when vulnerability felt terrifying. And in quiet moments of reflection, the avoidant may recognize something that feels both beautiful and bittersweet. That connection was real. It mattered. It changed them. But sometimes the deepest truths about love only reveal themselves after the opportunity to protect that love has already passed. And that is the final lesson many avoidants learn. Some people enter our lives not just to share a chapter with us, but to reveal the depth of connection we were too afraid to accept at the time. By the time we fully understand their value, they have already grown strong enough to walk forward without us. And the memory they leave behind becomes a quiet reminder for the rest of our lives. A reminder that the rarest kind of love is not the one that demands perfection. It's the one that sees the truth of who we are, stands patiently beside us, and offers connection without judgment. But when that kind of love is rejected, it doesn't always wait forever. Sometimes it simply moves forward, carrying its depth to a place where it will finally be cherished.